Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Mira Sholivar. I'm a freshman studying applied math and government at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. And join me in welcoming Harvard College undergraduate Cameron Hong.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Cameron Hong. I'm a first year at Harvard College studying social studies and economics, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. In today's polarized political climate, disinformation can spread quickly, and many voters have grown fatigued and distrustful of the political process. With divisions running so deep, people are increasingly questioning whether our democratic institutions are worthy of their trust. In face of these challenges, moral leadership has never been more important as we strive to restore faith in our institutions. Our forum tonight will explore how principled moral leadership can bridge these divides and renew public trust in our democracy. I'm so honored to welcome our speaker, Congressman James E. Clyburn. Now in his 16th term representing South Carolina's 6th District, Congressman Clyburn is one of the longest-serving members of Congress. He has held numerous leadership roles over the years, serving as Assistant Democratic Leader from 2011 to 2018, and again during 2023 to 2024. He also served twice as House Majority Whip from 2007 to 2010, and from 2019 to 2022, helping to steer critical legislation through the House. I, like many young Americans, find inspiration in Congressman Clyburn's unwavering commitment to integrity and public service. Our moderator for tonight is Anthony Foxx. Anthony Foxx is the director of the Center for Public Leadership and the Emma Bloomberg Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he helps prepare the next generation of public leaders. He previously served as the 17th United States Secretary of Transportation from 2013 to 2017, and before that as the mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina from 2009 to 2013. Please join me in welcoming our guest for tonight.
Good evening. Good evening. It's great to join you all here. Thank you for the wonderful words of introduction. And it's great to have you here with us, Representative Clyburn.
Thank you.
Tonight we're going to cover a range of topics, and we'll turn to Q&A shortly after the hour. But before we get into any substantive political conversation, I'd like to start, Representative Clyburn, with a question. You know, we think about people and their ideologies and what makes them say one thing or the other. I tend to find that people's life experiences play a role in how their political philosophies have been shaped. Can you talk a little bit about your background, what shaped you and shaped the ways that you think about issues as you've evolved as a leader in Congress?
Well, thank you very much for that. But before I answer that question, let me thank all of you for being here. Thank you for your long-time friendship. I first met Anthony when he was on City Council in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I knew I was meeting someone special. And I want to thank you so much for that. And I also want to welcome, there are three other Clyburns in here. My chief of staff is here, but there are three other Clyburns. Two are my first cousins once removed, and one is my first cousin twice removed. They always want to call me uncle, but I make them do it right. So I want to thank them for being here. Let me just say, I grew up in a home that I was fortunate to have two parents in the home. My father was a fundamentalist minister, which was his calling. My goodness, the secretary.
That's right. Secretary Fudge is right here. Yeah.
I'm not too sure how to answer this question now, thank you. But my father was a fundamentalist minister. It was his calling. That's not the way he made his living. He was a contractor, but he was known mostly as Reverend Clyburn. My mother was a beautician who was very civic-minded. Grew up in a cotton field over in Lee County, which at the time we were growing up was the largest cotton-producing county in the state of South Carolina. Now that was what I grew up in. My dad had two rules. Well, he had a lot of rules, but there were two special rules he had. Number one, every morning before you lift the fork to your lips, you had to repeat a Bible verse. And you couldn't say the same one twice. And on the day he laid down that rule, he took Jesus' wept off the table. Number two, every evening before retiring to bed, we had to share with him a current event. No matter what your homework was for the day, when you finish your homework, we had to share with him a Bible verse. We didn't have a television. And so in order to do that, you had to read the Bible. He would never tell us to read the Bible, but we had to say that Bible verse. And so I grew up, and my dad really thought he was training me for the ministry. And I thought that's what I was going to do, follow him into the ministry. And I never shall forget, my sophomore year at South Carolina State, I had gotten involved in the sit-ins. I was one of the 7 to organize the first sit-in in South Carolina. And I went home to tell my dad that I was not going to go to the seminary as we had planned. And he said to me on that day, well, son, I suspect the world would much rather see a sermon than to hear one. And I have never, ever forgotten that. I always thought for a long, long time that was original with him, but I have discovered the poem, which is very, very extensive. But my dad was very well read, and he had to be, because at the time he was growing up in Kershaw County, South Carolina, next door to Lee County, no school was provided for blacks beyond the 7th grade. And he wanted to go to college. And the reason they went to Sumter was because a college was there. So my dad studied, self-educated, got himself to the point where he could pass a college entrance exam. And he did. But he was not allowed to graduate because state law said you could not graduate college. You weren't even supposed to attend until you produced a high school diploma. Well, he could not produce a high school diploma because he didn't have one. And so he ended up getting his degree 20 years after he passed away. And that's because the president of the college walked into an auditorium one day when I was telling that story. I didn't know the president was there. I don't think I would have told the story if I had known he was in the room. But he came in quietly after I started to speak, and he came up to me afterwards and questioned me about it. He said, "Is that true?" I said, "Well, Mr. President, I don't think my dad would have told me that if it were not true." And so about 3 days later, he called me back. He said, "I went into the archives, and I found your father's records. Every word of it is true, and we are going to correct that. And I want you to come at the next commencement, and we are going to award your dad his degree." And the interesting thing about that was my daughter, Jennifer, was getting her 3rd degree on that same day. And I said to Jennifer, I'm not going to come to your commencement because the college is going to award my dad, your grandfather, his degree on that day. So I've been to 2 of your commencements. I think I can miss this one. And so she told me, she says, you mean that granddad is going to finally get his degree? I said, yes. She said, well, they can mail me mine. I'm going with you. So that's the kind of whole thing. And yesterday, I had a long lunch with those 3 daughters. There's seldom a day that goes by when I don't talk to all 3 of them. We have a very close knit family. And so coming out of my mother and father's home, getting married, I got married at the age of 20. Stayed married for 58 years to the same woman. We were just, that is what has made me who and what I am.
Thank you for that. We're here, and one of the themes for tonight is moral leadership. Can you define that?
No. You know, I think that we ought to really be truthful about these kinds of things. I know, I know what I think is required of me, and this may surprise a lot of people growing up in the fundamentalist Christian church and being born and raised in the parsonage. But my favorite Bible verse is Micah 6:8. For he's shown the old man that which is required. Do justly, love mercy, and be humble. To me, that is my moral compass. To do that which is just, to be merciful, and to be humble. Marsha Fuss, who was here, used to get on me a lot when she thought I should be cursing somebody out, and I wouldn't do it. Because I really feel very strongly that no matter what the issue is, you ought to do your part in trying to maintain a climate or an atmosphere within which to solve the problem or be able to have your suggestion or your resolution accepted as being something more than a soundbite. And so when you talk about the morals in the country, this country, we struggle with that which is moral. I met with a student earlier who wanted to talk to me about John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, South Carolinian, the guy is just a horrible person who believed strongly in slavery. I think that what he stood for at that particular juncture in our state's history was morally acceptable. It was morally acceptable. You may not want to accept that, but it was a fact. And so I think that I look upon morality like the Supreme Court Justice who once said of our Constitution that it's a living document that makes adjustments and makes changes based upon the times within which we live. So I have no idea what the moral underpinnings of this country will be next year this time. And I don't think anybody else here. I do believe this very strongly, that what happens in this country over the next year will pretty much tell us what the morality will be going forward. And having said that, I cannot tell you what it did to me when I picked up my device. I came from South Carolina today, but I came through Washington, and when I stepped off the plane in Washington to get the shuttle up here, I pulled out my device, and this headline smacked me in the face that Harvard University had rejected this program. And I would feel very strongly that could very well, as I said to someone earlier, that may break the fever. That may break the fever. I really hope it does. I do know this. If Harvard had capitulated, I really fear for what next year would be.
Thank you. I don't want to spend a lot of time rehashing recent events, but I think there are a lot of people in here who probably want to hear your take on the 2024 election cycle. And more or less, the setup is this. I know you are very close to President Biden.
Yeah.
And I also know that once he stepped out of the race, you ultimately supported Vice President Kamala Harris. Can you take us behind the scenes and sort of deconstruct the last election cycle and tell us kind of what you think happened, what went wrong?
I suspect I got licensed to do that now. The book, Fight, I think that's the name of the book that's out now, that's gone behind the scenes quite a bit. And I'm not going to say it's 100% correct, because I have not read the book. I'm waiting on them to send it to me. They're probably waiting on me to buy it. But I've really, because I've been real busy trying to finish my third book, which will be released later this year. I have finally gotten the book finished. Marcia Fudge, I finished it. And spent the weekend writing acknowledgments and the dedication of the book. But let me just say this. Joe Biden, in my opinion, and no matter what anybody says to the contrary, if you study the substance, the problem is we are in an era when substance takes the back seat to style. Stylistically, Joe Biden, and I said that to him, I said, Mr. President, the big problem that you have is that the style that people are looking for, you're never going to be able to give it to them. The substance, nobody in my lifetime, since I'm about to celebrate the 46th anniversary of my 39th birthday, I've had a pretty long life. And so come July, I turn 85. Wow. And so that means during my lifetime, I've had Roosevelt. I was born when Franklin Roosevelt was president. And on substance, Roosevelt was great. His substance did not apply to everybody in an equitable manner. People don't realize that Roosevelt did what was necessary to bring the country out of the quagmire, out of the Depression. Everybody knows, and will step. I've seen it recently this week. People talking about how great Social Security was, how he brought. I think I saw yesterday. It must have been yesterday. That 78% of senior citizens in this country lived in poverty in the 30s. And because of Social Security, that number had dropped to around 10 or 12%. But Social Security, 65% of African Americans were not allowed to join Social Security. Social Security did not cover domestic workers, did not cover farm workers. And that's where 65% of African Americans in the country, that's where they were. So they were not part of Social Security. And so I've always held that against Franklin Roosevelt. I held it against him because he refused to integrate the armed services. When the armed folks coming back from World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen having become heroes of that war. They're making moves about them, but wouldn't let them. And one of them, had been accepted into Harvard, and could not get the GI Bill to attend. These things on substance. Joe Biden looked at this country, and what he did with the rescue plan, with his so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill, with the CHIPS and Science Act, we, in the PAC Act, we talk about World War II. The PAC Act went back and picked up all those soldiers from the Vietnam War who had gotten, because the chemicals that they were exposed to were not listed in the law. When we first, I forgot that real prevalent disease that everybody had, Agent Orange. We took care of Agent Orange, but there were other chemicals, and those other chemicals did not get covered. And so Joe Biden goes, it looks like this, he goes back and picked up all of that. On substance, nobody since Lyndon Johnson has been more substantive than Joe Biden. You can look at any metric that you may want to use, and you won't get, and you can't surpass it. So when you look at the campaign, he had all the substance he needed. But the debate, you can't run from that. I've seen stories about why I watched the debate alone, which I did. But that's not unusual for me. When I first ran for office, I was declared the winner at 10 o'clock in the evening. And I got a visit from a TV reporter at 3:30 in the morning telling me I'd better get down to the courthouse because something is going wrong with the count. So I went to bed thinking I had gotten elected to the state legislature, and then was told at 3:30 in the morning that someone forgot to carry a 1 when they were adding up the votes, and rather than being a 500 vote winner, I was a 500 vote loser. That'll make you watch campaigns alone. And so usually on election nights, I don't hang around in crowds. I go home and I watch it alone. So there was nothing unusual about me watching that debate alone. But I told everybody that I did not have a good feel. And so I was going to stay home. And I did. And I knew 10-15% into the debate that this was not going to be a good night. And so that put a nail in the coffin. And so I was not surprised that we were not able to overcome that. But when he called me to tell me that he was going to get out of the race as soon as he hung up, I called Marcia Fudge. I really did. As soon as he hung up for me, I called Marcia. And I told her, I said, now you know how to do this. Get our kitchen cabinet on the phone. And so she set up the conference call while I was still in my car. And within 10 minutes of his having announced, we just thought that it would be problematic for the campaign if Joe Biden were to get out of the race and allow the headline to be, he made a big mistake with his first decision. What do we say about a nominee for president? That his first decision, his selection, of his running mate is indicative of how good he is at decision making. And so I said to him on the phone, I said, you cannot afford to not endorse Kamala, because the failure to do so would be admitting to the world that you made a mistake when you picked her. So whatever it is, you got to live with it. That was my advice. And so when I called Marsha and Cedric and Lacey and Benny, they were surprised that they were getting out. I really wasn't surprised, because I had just been on a trip with him. We had gone to the NAACP National Convention, and on my way to the convention, we talked a whole lot. He never talked to me about the campaign. He was talking to me about legacy stuff. And he would always talk to me about the conversations he would have with his dad, and comparing that to conversations we would have. And so when we got out to Las Vegas, where the convention was, he made his speech, which was a good speech, one of the best speeches he ever made. Afterwards, we sat down and ate a sandwich together. He never talked about the campaign. And the next morning, I had to go back. I didn't come back with him. I went back, and I started telling people, Joe's not going to run. So I was not surprised. I think his mind was made up a week earlier than he really announced that he was going to throw the towel in. So there's not much to the backdrop than that. The debate started the cascading, and it all came to a head when a few people went public, which I think I understand there was one private meeting that I'm now hearing about. I didn't know about that meeting before, but I think if a group of party leaders had sat down with him and gone through everything that was being said and what was happening, it could have been a better exit than what it turned out to be.
Thank you. I want to turn now to the present. As we sit here, dramatic changes are underway in the federal government. The president has expressed a clear intention to dismantle several federal agencies. Some have already been, including USAID. There's discussion about the Department of Education. Hundreds of thousands of federal employees have taken buyouts or been terminated altogether. The post-World War II world order is on life support, if it still has a pulse. And what is often talked about in political circles is the incessant polarization. So I offer the preamble to pose this question. Are you optimistic right now?
I'm hopeful, and I'm a pretty optimistic person, but I'm fearful. I just have to admit that. I'm fearful. Hopeful, but fearful. And the reason is very simple. We are, relatively speaking, we are a young nation. And we've seen countries go through this before. And as strong of a nation as we have been, there have been strong nations before us. And I think that history ought to be instructive. And you don't you have to learn from history. You can't just deny it. You can't misrepresent it, because the facts are the facts. And the history is there. And we know what happens and what will happen based on what has happened. And so I'm fearful because I'm not too sure that enough people have learned the lessons of history. Who was it? George Santayana? See, one of my favorite people, your former president, is here. If we fail to learn the lessons of history, we're bound to repeat them. Now, I'm fearful that we may not have learned the lessons. And if we have not learned those lessons, we could repeat them. So yes, as optimistic as I am, I'm fearful. I really am. And I've told my daughters that. In fact, we find ourselves talking politics now more than we ever have, because I've told them when something props up. I can't wait to get back home tomorrow night, and so we can talk about what Harvard just did.
Many commentators are expressing concern that in the face of all these dramatic changes, the Democratic Party seems to lack some coherence. True or untrue? Either way, what do you think the response should be?
I think that we've got to broaden that, our response to that, and I've been telling my party that just because you fail to win an election doesn't mean that you are wrong for the country. It doesn't mean that at all. If you just go legislatively, I just went through the CARES Act, you go right through it, the country is with the party in all of those things. So then what the problem is? Everybody said, well, the problem is the message. No, it's not the message. Your message come right out of those spots. That's not what the problem is. And I'll admit, the party is suffering from branding. And the question is, did we brand ourselves or have we been branded? The party has been branded. As recent as today, the governor of Pennsylvania just had a horrible experience. But in addressing that experience today, he may not realize it, but he hedged on it when he talked to the media. No Democrat, this person who did this made it very clear that he hated the governor, and he's trying to see now whether is that hate because he's Jewish, or is that hate because he was a Democrat? This was the first night of Passover, wasn't it? Yeah, yesterday. So why was it? So why we keep excusing this stuff, and why we keep sort of refusing to put the blame where it is? And I just go crazy. I'm going to give one of the best examples. The best example I know is if you go back and study the history of the Democratic Party, I believe it was 1828 when we became a party. It's the Democratic Party, TIC. But the media brands us according to the articulations of the Republicans, which is an insult, the Democrat Party. Just listen, and you see they are doing the branding. And I tell every media person I talk to, they says, what are you Democrats going to do? I said, we're going to follow your lead. You all write the stories. You all brand the parties. And the stories you write, because I told the young man I talked to earlier, I said, I can talk to you for an hour. And you decide to take 10 seconds out of that, and that becomes your story. And it's out of context. What the heck can I do about it? Nothing. And that's what it is. The Democratic Party does not sell well. Hate sells. Hate sells. And people are going with what sells. That's what's going on. So I don't know how we get out of this, but we're in deep, and I'm not too sure that the American public can afford to wait on the Democrats. I think you've got to decide whether or not you want love or hate. I'm not too sure people realize that. I said to my caucus, every Wednesday when the Black Caucus meets, for some reason I must be the oldest guy in the room, because they have something they call Clyburn's Corner. I'm not making this up. So, and every Wednesday they expect to hear something from me. And I said to them the other day about the headlines. There's a big difference between headlines and headway. Do you want to make headway or make headlines? And what I've said to them, if you want to make headway, you might ought to think about giving up some headlines. X is the biggest thing out there. And all of us, including me, got a bigger following, we think, on X. Much bigger than Blue Sky. And I said to them, if you want to make headway, work with Blue Sky. If you want to make headlines, then work with X. Because they ain't following you, they are trolling you. There's a big difference. When people talk about how many hits they get, I tell them, how about look into those hits and see what they're saying about you? So I think that the Democratic Party has a problem with branding because hate sells. And we're not haters. It's hard to get a Democrat to say something hateful. It's hard. Some of them do, but it's hard. And when we should, we don't. The other side, it is so easy to just spew hate, because they decide how much it comes into the coffers and what sells.
We are at 8:10. We're going to start having questions. So if you have questions, please make your way to the microphone. Let me ask you one more question about history, because you mentioned history. There is conversation in Washington about the Smithsonian, about the Kennedy Center, about the Afro-American Museum of History and Culture, and about the president either changing people out of positions or closing down facilities. Can you talk a little bit just about what you think that's about?
What I think it's about?
Yeah.
Whitewashing history. That's all it is, whitewashing history. I just said to you, this book that I've just finished, during Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, now I'm stickler for getting it right, Reconstruction didn't last for 13 years, a few days and months, but this notion, and I don't know why historians do that. I hope I'm not violating anything here, but a lot of historians will take Reconstruction from January 1, 1860, let's just say January 1, 1863 is when the Emancipation Proclamation, the second one, became effective. There were two proclamations, one limited to the District of Columbia, and then the other one for the rest of the slave states. And then I say it came to an end in 1877 when the Tilden-Hayes Compromise. Well, shouldn't call it that because it's really not that. It was Tilden and Hayes. I call it the Great Betrayal. And when the Great Betrayal took place in 1877, it was all over. I think that period when you had 17 African Americans serving in the United States Congress, 8 of whom were from South Carolina. This book is about those 8 people and putting them in the proper perspective. You hear everything, you talk all the day about how important barbershops are to campaigning. Well, the very first African-American to serve in Congress was a man named Joseph Rainey from Georgetown, South Carolina. Guess what he was? He was a barber. There's nothing new about that. The fourth one to serve was Richard Kane, who became a bishop in the AME Church. He is the one who went down to Charleston, South Carolina after 1822's Denmark Vesey's insurrection to rebuild Emmanuel AME Church. So there's nothing new about the black church and politics. That's been there. It's been there. In fact, the only way you could be independent enough to be involved in politics and not have to worry about repercussions would be to be a preacher like my daddy was, or a beautician like my mother was. I became a hero during the sit-ins when Matthew Perry called me his. You remember Matthew?
Judge, absolutely, yeah.
Matthew Perry, I was his prized witness when they put me on the stand. The only reason they put me on the stand back then is because my parents were insulated from the system. Because anybody, when your name got in the newspapers back in the 60s, your parents lost their jobs. But there were no white people coming to our church. And my mother wasn't fixing the white people's hair. So I was insulated. So they said, you're going to take the stand. That made me a hero. So I owe my parents a whole lot. But that's, those kinds of things are ingrained in this system. And so it's all there. And we build on it. We just don't know what we're doing. If we just think about what we're doing, the 7th African-American to serve in Congress from South Carolina was the first president of South Carolina State University. Thomas Miller, the first president, left the House of Representatives after leaving the Congress to become so this stuff is built in, and if we just move with it, build on it, we'll be in a much better place. We keep trying to think that things are new. There's nothing new about this. My dad used to tell me all the time, son, there's nothing new under the sun, nothing. And the longer I live, the more I realize he was right. Just build on what's there. Yeah, I'm sorry.
First off, thank you so much for coming, Representative Clyburn. It is such an honor, especially
in these unprecedented times that we're in, to have someone with your experience, it is, again, just such an honor. But what I was curious about is that at the start, you talked a lot about how your Christian faith has informed your political decision-making and your political identity. And I also know that on the other side, there are some right-wing elements who weaponize Christianity to do some things that I personally, and I think you also disagree with. So I was wondering, what do you think is the best way to kind of combat this weaponized Christianity? Thank you.
I don't know how you do that. I do believe very strongly that we have to study the fundamentals of Christianity like we study any religion. The first year I ever got in school was a paper I wrote on the 8 great religions. And fundamental to all of that is the one word, L-O-V-E. That's fundamental to every one of the Christian, or every one of the religious groupings. Now, what you see today is people misusing Christianity, Judaism, you name it. People find ways to misuse it. If you don't believe that, I can take you back, not far back, and watch people standing on the floor. I still think about a man standing on the floor not long ago of the Louisiana legislature justifying slavery with biblical passages. So I think that what we have to do is go back to the basics of these faiths rather than current application of them. When you get to be my age, you don't mind calling that. When, my dad was, not my mother, but my dad had a certain belief in Billy Graham. For some reason, my mother never did. I don't know why. She must have known that Franklin was coming along, if you get my drift. Now, Billy Graham, his son Franklin has taken over Franklin's application of Billy Graham's sermons are almost the opposite to what Billy Graham preached. And they're preaching from the same book. And he's using the same organization that he used. So I would say to people, stay with the basics. And don't get caught up in how people use these religions and other things as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Congressman. Thank you so much for coming out. I want to go back to the issue of the African American Museum. I'm in Professor Henry Lewis's Gates class, and he brought it to our attention about the really harmful statement that, to me, is ever made coming out of this administration. And briefly, with regards to the exhibit there, he said, the exhibit further claims that sculpture has been a powerful tool in promoting scientific racism and promotes the view that race is not a biological reality, but a social construct, stating race is a human intervention, right? To me, that's really like resowing the seeds of fascism, challenging this notion about race being a biological construct. So some of the students here at Harvard, we take great offense to that. Could we work with your office in crafting language to bring this to the floor, to call people on this issue to see where they stand? Because I think that's really appalling.
Well, you can work my chief of staff is back there. There he is right there. And you may check with Gabriel, and I'll really have them to work on. That is something that Yebe will work on. And we have Matthew, who is, I guess he's full-time general counsel now, and who is Jewish. I'll have the two of them to give it to me, and he is fundamentalist Baptist. So between that Baptist and the Jewish guy in the office, we might be able to come up with something to be helpful.
Thank you so much.
We'll see.
Hi, Congressman. First and foremost, thank you for being here. My name is Alyssa. I'm a junior at the college studying social studies and art history. And I'm really interested in how, in the most recent election, the Democratic Party saw losses and kind of de-affiliations from demographics who have traditionally been pretty loyal voting groups. And I'm wondering, in your view, what could the party do to adjust or to recover these kinds of losses? Maybe why has the party felt so alienated from these voters, or why have these voters felt alienated from the party, and what can we do to kind of recover these people who've long been invested in a certain kind of partisan politics, and now we're seeing changes?
Well, once again, we have to learn to adjust to the media environment that we currently live in. And, you know, it's tough. I mean, it's easy for me to see what the problem is. I don't know if I can tell you how to solve that problem. My oldest daughter, Mignon's spent about 9 years on the Federal Communications Commission. She is somewhat of an expert in this. People still pay her a lot of money to talk about these things. And I talked to her a lot about this. And really, we're struggling with how to combat these sound bites, how to combat people's belief in what they see. You know, when I was growing up, people said, well, yeah, I know it's true because it's in the newspaper. Well, we now see newspapers are saying we are no longer going to have responsibility for telling the truth. So I don't know how you combat that. When you've got the Washington Post and my homeboy, Eugene Montgomery, who's from Orangeburg, South Carolina, just resigned from the Washington Post. This guy, all because the owner of the Post is saying to him, you can't write your opinion pieces critical of this administration. We've got law firms where I had a long talk last night with lawyers who are leaving these law firms because they are being told they can't say anything critical of this administration. So it's not a Democratic Party problem. I don't care what the Democratic Party does. If we allow, if the universities, the biggest law firms in this country, the biggest media conglomerates, if they have decided that they are going to misrepresent the truth, ignore these this unethical behavior, I start to call it the no, but these are well-planned events. And it didn't just start. The morning or the evening before President Trump's first address to the joint session, it was not a State of the Union. Marcia Fudge and I believe it was Cedric Richmond, were on CNN conducting what we call a pre-buttal. I'm talking about 2017. And I said something on there that night Don Lemon was hosting. And Don Lemon says, "Are you calling Donald Trump Hitler?" I says, "No. He's Mussolini. Putin is Hitler." That's what I said that night. And the Charleston papers ran a big headline of what I said. My office was inundated. I don't have to say it now. Everybody else is saying it. So this is bigger than the Democratic Party. All we can do is put together, try to get good candidates, try to put together a platform, run it as best we can, and then we're at the mercy of whether or not the Washington Post is going to print the stuff. You know, there's no way that you can make these people even sell you an ad. If somebody said, the way they're going now, they says, "I want to advertise on the radio station," they says, "Well, we aren't going to advertise with you Democrats. We aren't going to accept any ads." So we've gotten rid of the fair comment doctrine. We've gotten rid of the equal time. We've gotten rid of all of these things. And that started with Ronald Reagan. We don't enforce those laws anymore. They never came off the book. It's still there. We just don't enforce them. So if you can say anything you want about me, and I don't have any mechanism, and I say I want to respond to you on this radio station, the guy says, "We aren't going to accept an ad from you." What can I do about it? That is what is going on. That is what, is it Bezos that owned the Washington Post? Bezos? What did he say? He says that we aren't going to fact check this president. He can say anything he wants to say, tell any lie he wants to tell, and we're going to print what he says, and we aren't going to fact check him. What can the party do about that? We can't. I mean, the Republican Party doesn't have to do it because Fox News is out there doing it for them. We don't have a Fox News. And if we did, I don't know what kind of climate we would be creating if that's all we do is go out there and just lie. Really, that's where we are. That's why I'm going to keep coming back to this. I hope I don't get the university in trouble. But I think that you all took the first step toward breaking the fever.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm standing on my tiptoes. So. Okay, there we go. Alyssa asked such a great question, and I kind of want to build off of that. I've been thinking a lot about this kind of branding concept that you mentioned tonight, the decision to move forward with Kamala, which, you know, I think was great counsel. And I'm curious if there's any insight you can offer as to the party's thought process in building the brand of up-and-coming candidates for the next election from the Democratic perspective, and kind of if there's any kind of behind the scenes you might be able to give us, because the person I see building the biggest brand at the moment is Gavin Newsom. He just came out with a podcast. He's doing kind of reach across the aisle style interviews, and that's great if he's who the party is kind of choosing to back, because I do think, to your point, we need a cohesive voice to be able to thoughtfully counter some of the media weight and narrative that is coming from all sides. And so I'm curious just if there's any insight you could give into how the party is thinking about kind of the next wave of leaders that might be coming forward, and how we can mobilize them earlier rather than later in advance of our kind of upcoming opportunities, either the midterms or the next presidential election.
Well, the lunch, I spent about a 2.5-hour lunch yesterday with my 3 daughters, and talking about this, and we were looking at how, if it's possible, to circumvent or in some way, I shouldn't circumvent is maybe not a good word, to respond to this reality. Mm-hmm. How do we develop some vehicle to get beyond that wall that's being built? Because I think when Gabby Newsom addressed this issue 2 or 3 weeks ago, he says the Democratic Party brand is poisonous or something, toxic. He said the brand is toxic. Well, my question to Gabby was, how did that happen? What did we do as Democrats to become toxic? Did we become toxic because Joe Biden failed in a debate? Did we become toxic because of the CARES Act or the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, the PAC Act? How did we become toxic? What Democrat did what to make us toxic? Not one darn thing. So how did it happen? So my thing with Gabby, and if you have any relationship with him, tell him to focus on how this happened. And that's why I think, and I keep telling my party, let's focus on this process. Because on substance, ain't a thing wrong with this party. And when you go to substance of what's coming from the other side, everything is wrong. So why do they have a better brand than we have? Because somebody else is doing the branding. No cow on any ranch ever branded itself. Who is doing the branding? So that's our problem. And so I just think that all of us, especially coming off a great university campus like this, let's start focusing people's attention on this process that's taking place out there. Everybody knows that Fox News misrepresent things all day, every day. And how many people will say it? Every time I criticize one of them things, that I hear from daughter number 2, who follows everything on social media. Daddy, you see what they're saying about you? Well, yeah, I don't see it, but I can imagine what they're saying. Simply because I've just decided that I'm not going to take it. I'm going to say it. But most people have not lived as long as I have, and so they've got a problem with saying these things. And maybe Gabby thinks, you cannot become a good Democratic nominee by being Republican light. You got to go all in and be who you are. And quite frankly, if you go back and look at the campaign, Joe Biden won the presidency by being Joe Biden. He ran his campaign. Everything you see reduced, that big infrastructure bill, he had that in his campaign, and people flocked to him, and he won. And of course, the branding took place. And they spent all their time making him a pariah. The most effective Speaker of the House in our lifetime has been Nancy Pelosi. But they've made a pariah out of Nancy Pelosi. She didn't brand herself that way. And I just saw a report this morning about what happened to Pennsylvania governor last night, or night before last. And the president reacted to it and talking about how bad that is. What was his reaction to Paul Pelosi? Y'all remember? He made a joke out of Paul Pelosi being attacked by a hammer. This guy had a hammer and said he was going to use it on the governor if he had encountered him. And here's that same guy talking about how bad that is and we can't tolerate that. He made a joke out of that. That's the same kind of weapon that Paul Pelosi. If we were to say something like that, any Democrat would say something like that, he would be excommunicated from the party. But this guy says and gets away with it and nobody says anything. So this problem is not going to be solved by the Democrats. We are powerless to solve the Brandon problem because the laws that were in place to keep this kind of thing from ever happening, they went into place, if my memory serves, 1938, I believe, is when the equal time and all those kind of laws went into place. And all of a sudden, we got rid of all of that so that these people, I mean, what was that guy the first guy that started all the hate stuff on the radio? Rush Limbaugh. They had Rush Limbaugh waiting to get rid of this stuff. When they got rid of it, Rush Limbaugh was right there. They made him a very wealthy person and gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom for spreading hate. And we just made another hate spreader Secretary of Defense. It's the most amazing thing in the world. And he says, what you Democrats going to do about this? I don't know. Democrats don't own the Washington Post. We're going to have to decide to follow Harvard University's lead.
One last question to close us out.
Hi there, thank you so much, Congressman. I'm Mo, I'm an MPA student in my final year. And it rolls on a little bit from what my colleagues have kind of brought up. The Democratic Party is a very wide, broad church. Mentioned Gavin Newsom, but it was also another part of the party and caucus in Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who offer something fundamentally different to other parts of the party in terms of kind of an economic populist message, a kind of tapping into something that may have been tapped into by the Trump kind of movement in reclaiming kind of the working class roots that supports the original Democratic kind of electoral coalition. When you compare that to what we saw in the campaign, which was a party that was, I mean, you use the term Republican light, but I'm thinking of endorsements from folks like Dick Cheney and kind of this sort of modern day version of the year 2000 Republican Party. I guess where are we going? Are we going in this direction? Are we going in that direction? And is there a third way? Because they're pretty different.
Okay, we'll try to respond quickly. Sure. Yeah.
I don't know that both parties have a base to appeal to. And I think that the MAGA base is relatively small. I would give it 30% of what's on the Republican side. But that 30% seems to be controlling around 90% of the news. And on the Democratic side, I would say the progressives in the Democratic Party are 70%. There's no question about that. If you were to come down to North Carolina and South Carolina, we're progressives in North Carolina and South Carolina. You may not, up here, you would not call Governor Cooper or progressive. But we would call them that in South Carolina, in North Carolina. Because once again, it all depends upon the environment within which you work. And that's the problem, one of the big problems we have, because if you look at the way presidential elections are won and lost, it's basically, fundamentally, it's 17 states. 17 states is where these campaigns are conducted. Because we've designed this winner-take-all system. On the Republican side, even the primary is winner-take-all. You can win the North Carolina primary by 5 votes, and you get all the votes. Now, we got rid of that on the Democratic side once again, because we were being progressive. And being progressive, we decided we were prorated. We aren't going to let the candidate with 60% of the vote get 100% of the delegates. Republicans said, we don't care about that. You can get 51% of the vote. You won't get 100% of the delegates. And therefore, that small minority controls who comes out of the convention. Can't do that on the Democratic side. Did we cripple ourselves by being fair? By recognizing that 49% saying you are not give up all of your power when you're giving 49% of the vote? I don't know. There's a lot of reforming that has to take place. But I think in the interim, we would do well as a party to recognize these, I wouldn't call them obstacles, but the nuances that will make a party. I mean, how do you win unless you get good candidates? And you aren't going to get the good candidate if you apply these litmus tests to them. You've got to allow for candidates coming out of the South to have less than 100% liberal record if you're going to become a national candidate. And you require that they be 100%ers. You know, I know we're closer. So let me wrap up your question with a personal thing, if I may. I mentioned earlier that I stayed married to the same woman for 58 years. But how did that happen? Early in our marriage, a federal court decision came down involving Charlotte, North Carolina. The case was called Swan v. Mecklenburg. Yep. That was a case that ordered busing to integrate schools. Now, I thought that case was unfair to students, to children. I spoke out publicly against the decision. I was at some event, and the reporter came up to me and stuck the mic in my face, and I started waxing eloquently, or I thought. When I got home that evening, when I opened the door, my wife was standing in the middle of the floor, and tears were streaming down her face. And I rushed to her. I said, what's wrong? Did something happen to Mignon, who was our oldest at the time, or the only child at the time? She says, no, there's nothing wrong with Mignon. I just saw you on television, and there's something wrong with you. And she said, you sit down and let me explain something to you. Now, my wife grew up in rural Berkeley County. And when the Gullah Geechee woman says they're going to explain something to you, or she says, explain it, you got to listen. And she told me what it was like for her to have to walk to school 2.5 miles every day and walk right past the white school to get to the black school, which was not called a high school. It was called a training school. And she had to walk those same 2.5 miles back home every day. And the white kids had buses ride by them, throwing sometimes urine-filled balloons on them as they walked. She never learned to ride a bicycle. Those dusty roads she grew up on were not conducive for bicycles. She came to South Carolina State in a pickup truck. They didn't own a car. Her foot locker was on the bed of that pickup truck. And she said to me, they were not against busing then, and you bet not be against busing now. I grew up about 3 blocks from my elementary school, about 6 blocks from my middle school, which was what Lincoln was at that time. The dean here is from, we share the same hometown. And I'm a graduate of Mather Academy, that we called a boarding school back in those days, where my academic hall was like 35 steps from my dormitory. So I didn't know what it was like to grow up the way she grew up. And I knew then that I had to make some adjustments in my thinking. And I made those adjustments. And that's how we got to 58 years. Because I made those adjustments. Marsha First can tell you how well I made those adjustments. She got to know Emily very, very well. So what I'm saying to you is, when we talk about having a broad or big tent party, we got to learn how to tolerate each other under that tent. And if we want to get Democrats coming out of South Carolina, we got 7 Congress people. I'm the only Democrat, the only black. We've got no Democrats elected to statewide office. So, and the reason is because what is required to get a Democrat out of the primary will lose the election. Because we don't let either. So you got these far left winners of the primary, then they lose in November. If we were allowed a more moderate candidate to get out of the primary, you might have a chance of winning statewide. So that's all over. That's not just in South Carolina and North Carolina. That's all over. We lost a majority in New York City. Or state of New York, I shouldn't say the city. In the state of New York, we lost those 5 seats in New York, and we lost the majority by 3. It was right in New York. So, because the people who won the primaries could not win the generals, because we pulled them so far to the left until they could not overcome that when they got to the general. And we keep doing that. And I don't know why we just can't sit down and just say, okay, let's be strategic about this. and let's decide this person ain't 100% of what we want, but they're good enough to win the general. And that will get us in a better place to get an agenda. And that's going to happen to us at the presidential front. You know, I love Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, now if you go back and check, you will see Bernie and I have done more joint house and stuff together than anybody else. I've been doing his stuff on the House side that he does on the Senate side. And I think he does a great service to our party. But Bernie Sanders could not get elected in South Carolina. He couldn't get elected in South Carolina. I probably can't get elected in his home state. I do well in South Carolina, at least in the 6th district. I ain't going to run statewide. But I think, you know, all I'm saying to you is that I think that we have to sit down and decide that you can't get 100% out of these candidates. It's just like any other family. You have to decide what it is, what role you play, and how you play that role. Emily did not give public speech. She was not a public speaker. But she took notes on me. But she's the one that stopped me from reading speeches. Everybody wonders why I stopped doing it. Because she called me aside one day and she told me, she says, you know, you need to start reading speeches. She says, I watched the way the public react to you. They react to you much better when you don't read. So I want you to start reading speeches. Write it, read it, but when you get up to that mic, I want you going, I don't want you to read. That's what stopped me from doing it. It's harder. But that was her role. She would be in church, keeping notes. Never forget one Sunday we came out of church and she said, Clyburn said, do you know why Mrs. Brown got a problem with you? She never knew my first name, so she always called me Clyburn. I said, no, I didn't know. I didn't know she had a problem. She said, well, she does. She's got a problem with you. And you need to find out what it is. I said, okay, I'll give her a call. Tore that little piece of paper. Here's her phone number. You know, we just have to learn how to do things. We used to do it that way. During the sit-ins, I went to jail. But somebody had to raise the bail. You don't hold the bail, the guy raising the bail, to the same standard you hold the guy that's going to jail. So everybody needs to say, here's the role you play. This person could be the good candidate. We got to support this candidate. We ought not be demanding 100% from him. And until we as Democrats recognize that and support that, we're going to have a real struggle. Thank you.
Jim Clyburn, thank you. And thank all of you for coming. We'll see you next time. Thank you.